Hi there. In this video, we're going to discuss the exchanged variation of the French defense, which goes like e4, e6, d4, d5, and white decides to capture on d5. In my opinion, this move doesn't look very logical because white voluntarily solves black's main problem. I mean, after e6 takes d5, black no longer has a problem with the light square bishop. It's no longer limited with own pawns and has the same perspectives as white's light square bishop, for example. We also have absolutely symmetrical pawn structure here, so white no longer has the advantage in space and cannot really play for any real advantage in the center. But still, don't be fooled with the simplicity of this position because it may be tricky. What's important, white has to play aggressive chess here, because if white starts with something simple like bishop to d3, at first glance what can be more natural than just a development of the bishop here, black may grab the initiative with the c7, c5 move, attacking in the center and forcing white to make a decision already here. So there are two options, two major options, I would say, either to protect d4 pawn or to take on c5. We should understand that black has a threat of not only taking on d4, maybe it's not even a threat at the moment. The main thing is that black may continue with the c4 at some point, and the bishop will be forced to a passive position on e2 or maybe even on f1. That's not what white wants. So there are two options: to take on c5 and maybe to play c3 to be ready to meet c4 with the bishop to c2 move. Let's start with the c3 move. So in this case, black may continue with the knight to c6, again attacking d4, and still being okay with d takes c5. What's going on there we will look at a bit later. I mean the type of the position. Now let's focus on something that continues the development for white and avoids taking on c5. For example, the knight to e2 move. So flexible development of the knight. From here, the knight can jump to f4 at some point, attacking d5, which may be vulnerable. Or the knight may go to g3 with the idea of landing on f5 or h5 even. So here, black may continue with the c4, grabbing some space on the queen side. And after white's bishop to c2, continue with the natural development of the bishop to d6. We can see that black is going to develop his knight g8 to either f6 or e7 on the next move. And I suppose that development of the knight to e7 is more logical here, because if the knight is developed to f6, there may be a problem after bishop c1 to g5 move, pinning the knight and then attacking d5. When the knight is on e7, black always has something like f6 move in case white develops the bishop to g5. For example, bishop goes to f4, knight goes to e7, let's say castling. Black also castles in this position. White continues with the development of the knight. Black may become a bit more aggressive on the queen side because black managed to grab a bit more space there. So it's pretty logical to continue to play against the c3, because now we have this pawn chain. We already know that the attack of the bases is very important. And after something like knight to f3, actually intending to bring the knight to e5 at some point, or maybe to g5, that's also an option, black may continue with the f6 move, and I don't actually see how this position is bad for black. So black controls all the important squares. Black has no problems with protecting d5 pawn here. So there is a clear plan of expanding on the queen side with the help of a5 and then b4, and then, you know, just grabbing space there, maybe creating some weaknesses and so on. In the center, everything is safe because of this very important f6 move. So black is doing fine. Let's get back to the moment when white had a choice between playing c3 and taking on c5, and have a look at what happens if white captures on c5. So in this position, after d takes c5 and bishop captures on c5, black gets very simple development. So now all the pieces have pretty active positions to be developed. The only issue with this idea is that d5 pawn becomes an isolated pawn, so potentially it is a weakness. but it will take a long time for white to start an actual attack against it, and black will have enough time to prepare pretty active counterplay based on the activity of the pieces. For example, after knight to f3, knight to f6, just a normal development, castling and castling, white may continue with a very good-looking move, bishop to g5, and it may look even like a problem for black because the knight is pinned, the knight is a defender of the d5, so potentially there may be a problem with the d5 pawn. But black has h6 move, not only to check what white is going to do, because if white captures the knight, okay, fine, black will have pair of bishops and some concrete play on the king side. But what if bishop simply steps back to h4? Well, to get rid of this pin, black should probably go back with the bishop to e7, but it has nothing to do with active play. So, in fact, black may continue with a super aggressive g5 move here, and you will see that it's pretty typical for this type of positions. The idea is that the sacrifice on g5 doesn't offer white much because, you know, there is no problem with the knight f6. It's always possible to step back with the bishop to e7. So white's natural reply here is bishop to g3. And now, since the knight is no longer pinned, it can jump to e4. Super active setup. So now I think you understand that everything makes sense here for black. So bishop on c5, exerting some pressure on f2. The knight joins the party now, being placed in the center, supported with the pawn on d5. And what's important, black even has a chance to support it with another pawn. Let's say after knight e2, black may play f5. So the knight is perfectly protected here. There is a direct threat of just trapping the bishop on g3 or just locking it on that diagonal. Now, there is no even a chance for white actually to play something like h3 or h4 because black can take the bishop with the knight using the fact that f2 pawn is pinned. So the only real way for white to get rid of this problem is to take on b8. So like bishop e5 is also playable probably, but only for one move because after that black plays knight c6 and it's unclear where to go. So bishop captures on b8, in which case rook obviously captures. And we get very interesting position. So there is still a problem with the d5 potentially because it's isolated. Black committed some weakening of the king side, but we can see that black controls the situation in the center in this case and actually enjoys very active setup here. So there is a perspective of bringing the pieces to even more active positions. There is a perspective of just pushing the pawns. So everything that black has to do here in this position is to complete a development like this, centralize the pieces, and get ready to the attack on the king side. I think it's probably the best position, the best type of position you can get with black after the opening. So this means that if white wants to get some sort of advantage, or at least the initiative, white should start the active operations in the center as soon as possible. So let's get back to that moment where white decided to play bishop d3 and have a look what else is possible. So we have seen how black benefited from c5 move, which means maybe it makes sense for white to try a similar step. So indeed c4 is probably the most interesting continuation here, which leads to, again, interesting, active, dynamic positions with isolated pawns mainly in the perspective. So black can take on c4, but I think it makes sense to wait a bit and just to protect the pawn with the knight f6, continue the development. Since the bishop is not on d6, c5 is not an actual threat. In that case, black, as usual for this type of positions, may simply undermine the pawn, just get rid of it. And we should understand that if the bishop is on f8, it's always possible to change the direction slightly and just to develop it like this, let's say. And it makes sense because d4 is a backward, is vulnerable, so we need additional piece to attack that weakness later on. So white doesn't really want to play c5 in this position. Instead, white may continue with the knight to c3, exerting more pressure on d5 in this situation. And now black has to decide what to do with the dark squared bishop because it's time to continue the development to make castling. E-file is open, so it's not the type of position in which black may wait with the development of the king side. So there are two options, either bishop to b4 or bishop to e7. Bishop to d6 makes no sense because of at least c5. So if black plays bishop e7 here, then white continues with a knight to f3, castling something like bishop to d3, which makes sense. White wants to castle as well. c6, castling. Now it's time to do something with these pieces. Let's say bishop goes to g4, rook goes to e1, occupying the open file. And now, for example, if black decides to capture on c4 to get some play against the isolated pawn, which looks perfectly fine, then bishop captures. And after something like knight d7, being ready to play knight b6 with the tempo and then set up a blockade on d5. A bit later, white starts something that we have basically seen already. So h3, bishop goes away to h5, then just g4, bishop to g6, and knight jumps to e5. We already know what it means. So it's very active setup. Again, the typical plan is just to play f4, f5. The difference is that there is no option for black, for example, to take the knight on b1. It's not there anymore. So this position looks a bit annoying. For black, in my opinion, white has at least the initiative. So let's focus on the bishop b4 option, which looks a bit more logical and safer, at least. So in this position, instead of playing passive bishop to e7, black tries a bit more active bishop b4. What's the point here? Well, black just pins the knight, which fights for central squares. And basically, black is not that against to take the knight on c3. So the idea is just to quickly castle. Another point is to have this option of check on the e-file and not blockade it on bishop sleeping somewhere on f8. So in this position, white continues with the knight to f3. Black may simply castle. White continues with the bishop to d3. This looks logical because, you know, something like bishop e2 is not really different. I mean, if you put the bishop on e2, black may take on c4 and then play rook e8 check. So what's the difference then? d3 is a bit more active position anyway. And now after rook e8 check and bishop to e3, black just captures on c4, bishop captures on c4. And compared to other positions of this type that we have seen, we can see the difference. So white is not castled yet. The knight is pinned, which means d5 is not controlled enough. So black, I mean, doesn't have to play something like c6 to control it right now. So it's already controlled. And bishop e6 becomes an option. And I think it's a very important moment here because this bishop is a source of trouble for black. And it makes perfect sense just to get rid of it. The best way here is to get rid of own bishop, which doesn't find normally a good active position. So just a beneficial exchange for black, in my opinion. So the only potential problem is the pawn on b7, which is no longer protected. But it appears that tactically black is okay here. After bishop captures on e6, rook captures on e6, white is castling. Black plays knight to d7, continuing with the development. And now white tries to exploit the vulnerability of the b7, attacking the bishop on b4, in which case a5 is just a good option, good enough, because after white's a3, let's say, it's possible to take on c3. And after b takes c3, strengthening the situation in the center, especially supporting the d4, black may focus on playing for light squares here, just playing a4. Very important moment. This fixes the weakness on a3 first of all, and also starts the play on light squares. For example, this b3 square, which is temporarily occupied by the queen, becomes an interesting point for black's pieces in later play. Also pay attention to d5 and c4. This may be also occupied, potentially even supported by something like b5 move if white doesn't take here, or doesn't prevent b5 move. And then there may be an interesting blockading stuff, like with one knight on d5 and another one on c4. It will be just perfect. So white has to do something right now. It's not so simple because queen takes b7 just loses the queen after rook b6. So queen is trapped, black is winning, which means the pawn is not really hanging and black has no problems. This bishop is pretty passive, being limited with own pawns here. So another interesting option for white here after the a5 move is to go for this active d5, trying to at least activate the dark squared bishop. But it appears that black is fine here as well. After rook to e8, something like rook to d1, continuing some active operations in the center, black may use the e5 square, which became possible to occupy just after white played d5. So knight can jump to e5. For example, the exchange on e5, then something like bishop to d4. At very first glance, it looks annoying for black because it doesn't feel like black's pieces are coordinated here, but black solves all the problems with the help of just several accurate moves. First of all, rook to h5. Pretty interesting position for the rook here. So from here, the rook exerts pressure on h2 and still attacks the d5 pawn. Let's say pawn goes to h3 just to avoid all the negative consequences of the rook being placed on h5. In this case, black may play b6, just solving the problem of handing b7, which means the bishop is free. So now whenever white plays a3, black is no longer forced to capture the knight. It's possible just to come back. Well, d5 is under pressure. White has to make a decision. Something like capturing the knight doesn't look very convincing. So in the game we're following, white decided to play d6. So it's a tactical decision. Queen captured on d6. Then white captured on f6, attacking the queen. And after queen captured on f6, played knight to d5, attacking the queen and the bishop at the same time. So c7 is also under attack. Black kind of having problems with protecting everything here. So black decided just to play queen h4, active position for queen. And from here, the queen protects the bishop on b4. White captures on c7. The rook went away to f8. Of course, probably there was the other option, but f8 is pretty safe for now. And after knight to d5, let's say, and bishop to c5, once again, we have symmetrical pawn structure, but I do believe that black has better perspectives in this position. Why? Well, because of the bishop and the open position we have here on the board. It's typically better for the side which has the bishop. Moreover, here, black has absolutely concrete object of attack. It is the pawn on f2. You may argue that the knight on d5 is also pretty good, centralized and active, but I don't see what this knight is attacking except for pawn b6, but it's not that important here. Also, pay attention to the activity of black's heavy pieces. So it was just an example. Of course, all the moves that we have discussed were not forced, but I think it should give you a general sensation of what the exchanged variation in French defense is. So it's mainly about playing the positions with the isolated pawns with black or white pieces. So if you want to train your skills of playing against or with the isolated pawn, I would recommend to try this variation. Thanks for watching. See you in other videos.